Before the first gray light had touched the windows of Renfield Hall, while the great house still slept under its skin of frost, a woman in plain dark wool moved through the cold corridors, counting things that no one had asked her to count. She carried a single tallow candle, shielded with one cupped hand, and she walked without sound. For she had learned the trick of these floors, which boards groaned, which held their tongue, the way other women learn the faces of their children. The clock on the half landing had not been wound in 3 days. She wound it, because no one else would think to, and the small ratcheting whisper of the mechanism was the loudest sound in the house. In the muniment passage the air smelled of damp stone and old paper. In the kitchen offices it smelled of cold ash. She knew every smell of Renfield as she knew her own breath, and she had been here, by her own quiet accounting, 2 years and 4 months, and in all that time not one living soul beneath this roof had called her by her true name. They called her Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper. A widow, it was understood, though no one had ever seen a Mr. Hale, and a woman of no particular family, though she spoke her vowels too cleanly for a servant and held her spine too straight for a drudge. She stopped now in the unlit larder and lifted her candle to the deal shelf where the household ledgers were kept, and she ran her finger down a column of figures she had entered herself the night before. Coal, 400 weight delivered Tuesday, signed for by Vane's man. Coal, 200 weight only, by the scuttle and the cellar and the honest evidence of her own eyes. The discrepancy sat on the page like a stain. She had marked it. She would be made to suffer for marking it, and she knew this, and she marked it anyway, because a woman who has lost everything else does not surrender the last thing, which is the habit of seeing clearly. The discipline of that, of seeing clearly and saying nothing until saying something would land, had been built in her bone by bone, the way a wall is built, over 2 years of swallowing what would have choked a softer throat. She had reason that morning to test the whole height of it. The reckoning came at 9:30 in the servants' hall, with the undermaids ranged along the benches and the bootboy gawping in the doorway, because Mr. Jasper Vane liked an audience when he meant to put a woman in her place. He was the estate's steward and agent, a smooth-faced man of perhaps 35, who dressed a half-step finer than his station and carried himself as though the absent Earl's authority lived in his own waistcoat. He had the coal ledger open on the long table, and his finger planted on her notation, and he looked up at her with the particular pleasure of a man who has caught out his better. "Mrs. Hale," he said gently, for the cruelty of the gentleness was the point of it. "You have queried the colliery account. Perhaps you would be so good as to explain to me, a mere steward, you understand, with only the running of the whole estate to occupy him, how the housekeeper comes to know more of contracts and deliveries than the man who signs them." "I queried nothing, Mr. Vane," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I recorded what was received. 400 weight was billed. 200 weight came into the cellar. I have weighed it. The ledger should agree with the cellar, or the cellar should be made to agree with the ledger. I leave it to you which." A maid tittered and stifled it. Vane's color rose a careful degree. "You weighed it," he repeated. "And on whose instruction, pray? You forget yourself, madam. You forget what you are. A housekeeper accounts for candle ends and linen. She does not audit her steward. She does not sit in judgment on accounts that are the master's business and mine." He let the silence stretch, savoring it. "I have known clever servants before, Mrs. Hale. They are clever until they are turned off without a character, and then they are merely poor. And there is nothing in this world so tiresome as a poor woman who once thought herself clever. It was meant to break her, or at least to bow her, before the watching girls. Margaret Ainsworth, for that was the name no one in the room would have believed she owned, stood with her hands folded at her waist and did not so much as alter her breathing. She had been mistress of a house finer than this. She had checked drainage accounts and timber accounts and the wages of 40 men before she was 20, sitting at her father's elbow while he taught her that land was a living ledger and that the people who worked it were owed the truth of the figures. She let none of that show in her face. She let nothing show but a servant's stillness. "As you say, Miss Vane," she answered, "the figures are entered. The cellar is open to anyone who cares to weigh it." And she inclined her head exactly the degree that was owed and not 1 degree more, and the precision of it was its own small insolence, though no one could have named it so. The morning held a second blade. A county lady had come to call on the chance the new Earl might at last be in residence. A Mrs. Carberry, all feathers and condescension, and finding the master still absent and the hall in winter dishabille, she rounded her temper upon the nearest object, which was the housekeeper sent to attend her. "Girl," she said. Margaret was nearer 40 than girlhood, but the word was a whip and meant to sting. "This hall is a disgrace. Cobwebs in the gallery, the fires unlit, and you stand there as composed as a duchess. Is that impertinence I see in your face?" "It is. They breed up insolence in these great empty houses where there is no master to check it." Margaret curtsied. "I am sorry the hall displeases you, ma'am. We keep only the rooms in use. The family being from home, I will have a fire laid in the gallery directly, if you mean to wait." The calm of it baffled the woman more than any retort could have. She snorted, gathered her skirts, and swept out to her carriage, and Margaret stood a moment in the suddenly quiet hall and let out one slow breath, and that breath was the only luxury she permitted herself. And here, if you are still with me, let me speak to you plainly for a moment, you who are watching in the dark. Perhaps you have stood in a room, an office, a kitchen, a boardroom, a family table, and been spoken down to by someone who understood the matter at hand far less than you did, and you knew it, and they did not, and you held your tongue because the room was theirs and not yours. Perhaps you swallowed it and smiled and went home and lay awake with all the things you might have said. If you know that particular silence, then you already know this woman better than anyone at Renfield does, and this story is for you. Stay with her. Let her know you are listening. Leave a word below. Tell her you would have held your tongue too, and waited too, because she is waiting, and what she is waiting for is coming. To understand why a woman bred to command should be counting another man's coal, you must go back 2 winters, to a house called Ainsworth Grange, and to a name she was not yet ashamed to own. She had been Margaret Ainsworth then, the only child of Sir Henry Ainsworth, and there had been nothing of the servant in her. Her father had wanted a son and got a daughter, and decided, with the stubborn good sense that marked him, to raise the daughter to the work the son would have done. So Margaret had learned the land before she learned the harp, learned drainage and rent rolls and the law of settlements, learned to read a steward's flattery and a tenant's hardship, learned that an estate was a trust and not a treasure. The Grange would be hers. Her father had made it so, absolutely, in a marriage settlement drawn tight as a drum, so that whatever husband she took, the land and the fortune should remain her own and pass to her children after her. And a husband had been chosen, in the cool family way of such things, a distant cousin she had never met, one Julian, who stood next to inherit the earldom of Renfield, a young man abroad whose portrait she had seen and whose letters she had not. She had not minded the arrangement. She had thought, with the faith of the young, that two reasonable people might learn to do well by one another, and that a man who would one day hold land would want a wife who understood it. Then her father began to die, slowly through a long autumn, and into the sick room came the one man Sir Henry trusted past all others, his solicitor of 30 years, Mr. Silas Redgrave. A grave, soft-spoken man with ink-stained fingers and a face built for the reading of wills. To Redgrave dying, Sir Henry gave everything that mattered: the true will naming Margaret's sole heir, the marriage settlement that armored her fortune, and a letter sealed with his own ring to be carried to Julian, the cousin and heir, that the young man might know the worth of the woman he was promised and the wishes of the old man who would not live to see them wed. "He has the papers," Sir Henry told his daughter at the last, his hand light as a leaf in hers. "Redgrave has all of it. You need only trust him as I have trusted him." And then he was gone, and Margaret, 22 and grieving, did the one thing she had been taught never to do with an account. She trusted it unexamined. What Redgrave did, he did quietly, which is the way the worst things are done. He was not, it transpired, an honest man grown weary of honesty. He was a man who had waited 30 years for one unwatched moment, and he had found his confederate in Margaret's uncle, Cornelius Ainsworth, Sir Henry's younger brother, a heavy, grasping man who stood next in the male line and had long resented that a slip of a girl should hold what he thought nature owed to him. Between them they unmade her in a season, and never once raised their voices to do it. The true will was not destroyed. A destroyed will leaves a hole that questions find, but suppressed, locked away, and in its place Redgrave produced an earlier will, lately discovered, that left the Grange to the male heir, as the old entails had once intended. The settlement that secured Margaret's fortune simply ceased to exist in any drawer a stranger could open. And the story put about the county, gently, regretfully, by men who shook their heads over their port, was that poor Sir Henry had died all but bankrupt, his affairs a ruin, and that the Ainsworth girl, well, she had nothing. No fortune, no land, no claim. A pitiable thing. But there it was. That alone would have beggared her. But there was the matter of the betrothal, and a broken fortune is an awkward thing to wed, far cleaner to break the engagement first, and break it past mending. So Redgrave performed his masterwork. He wrote in confidence to young Julian, newly weighted with an earldom, barely a man, 300 miles abroad and friendless, a careful poison of a letter. The Ainsworth girl, he gave it to be understood, was no innocent. She was a fortune hunter who had seen which way her father's affairs were sinking and thrown herself. The moment the old man weakened, at a richer suitor, she had played the betrothed cousin false, and meant to jilt him the instant a better prospect was secured. And to prove it, for Julian was honorable enough to want proof, Redgrave enclosed a note in Margaret's own hand, or what seemed her hand, a forgery, cunning and intimate, in which she spoke slightingly of the cousin she had never met, and warmly of a lover she had never had. Julian was young and ashamed, and stung in his pride at the very threshold of a great inheritance he did not feel equal to, and he was counseled by men who had every reason to want the match dead. He never met her. He never wrote to her. He repudiated the engagement by a single cold letter, addressed to a lawyer rather than a lady, and then he did what shamed and wounded young men have always done. He went abroad and stayed there, 2 years and more, rather than stand in a county that whispered, and he carried with him the firm and bitter belief that he had narrowly escaped a schemer. He condemned a woman he had never seen on the word of the man who had ruined her, and he sailed away, and he did not know, could not know, that every word of it was false. And Margaret, in a single turning season, lost her father, her name, her fortune, and her betrothed. The county that had courted the heiress would not meet the eyes of the bankrupt jilt. There was no purse to fight Redgrave's papers in a court, and no lawyer who would take a pauper's case against a respected firm, and the law, which she had been taught to revere, closed over her head like cold water. She did the only thing left to a clever, ruined woman who would not lie down and die of it. She vanished. How she became Mrs. Hale was a thing she had reasoned out as coldly as any account, in the worst weeks of her life, and there was a terrible irony folded into it that only she could taste. She had a little money, a few pounds, some jewels of her mother's not yet swept up, and she had a marketable skill, for who knew the running of a great house better than the girl raised to run one? But where could the ruined Ainsworth heiress hide, with her forged reputation following her like a smell? Not among the gentry who knew her face. Not in any house where the county called. And so she had reasoned it through to its sharp, mad conclusion. The one great house in all the shire where no one would ever think to look for her was Renfield Hall itself. The seat of the very earldom she had been promised. The house that was to have been her own by marriage. It stood half empty, its earl abroad, run in absentia by her uncle's creature, that same Cornelius's reach, and by the smooth steward Vane. No fine lady would call there while the master stayed away. And there was a second reason, colder and more deliberate than the first, which she had told no living soul she suspected, from a thing her father had let fall about where the family papers passed, that the truth of her settlement, or some thread of it, had moved through this house's hands. If proof of her ruin lived anywhere within reach, it might live here. So she had taken a false name and a housekeeper's keys and walked in through the servant's door of the house she should have entered as its countess. And she had begun, very quietly, to wait and to watch. For 2 years and 4 months the waiting had yielded little but the daily discipline of being no one. And then, on a gray afternoon at the close of that long second winter, the household was thrown into a flurry by a letter that came under a London seal, and Vane read it aloud in the steward's room with his color high and his voice important. And the news of it ran through the kitchens and the stables before the candles were lit. The Earl was coming home. Julian, Earl of Renfield, 2 years and more abroad, was at last to take up residence at the Hall. Rooms must be aired, the gallery cleaned, the cellars set right. The master would be among them within the fortnight. Margaret heard it standing in the cold stone passage outside the steward's door, and she felt the news go through her like a draught through an open window, and she did not move for a long moment, and her face told nothing. Later, when the house had gone to its early sleep and the corridors were hers again, she took her shielded candle and walked the long gallery alone, past the dim ranks of dead Renfields in their frames, until she came to the one she had never let herself linger before. It hung between 2 windows, the paint a little darkened with smoke. A young man in a dark coat, fair-browed and unsmiling, with a stiffness in the pose that spoke of a portrait sat for under duress. Julian, the man she had been raised to marry and had been taught, by a forger and a thief, to hate. She lifted the candle until the flame trembled near his painted face, and she looked at him for a long time. The man who had condemned her sight unseen, who would now sleep beneath this roof, eat from plate she had counted, be served by hands she commanded, and who must not, for anything in the world, learn whose hands they were. Not yet, not until she held in them something harder than her own bare word. She would have to keep his house, and keep her secret, and keep her temper, all under the same roof and the same eyes, while the man who had broken her walked the floors she swept. The thought of it should have frightened her, and some cold corner of her did feel the danger of it move. But standing there in the dark, with the dead Earls watching, and the painted face of the living one above her, she felt something else stir for the first time in 2 years. Not fear, and not even the old grief, but the faint, particular quickening of a mind that has glimpsed, far off and dim as a candle at the end of a corridor, the first thin thread of how a buried truth might be dug back up into the light. He was coming home. And he was bringing with him, without the least idea that he did it, the only thing that might undo the men who had ruined her, a master in the house at last, with the right to open every locked door she had never been permitted to open herself. The Earl came home on a gray afternoon in March, and the household had been 3 days scrubbing for it. Peg stood at the foot of the great staircase, with the maids ranged behind her in a row of clean aprons, and she watched the traveling carriage swing through the gates she had walked past 1,000 times. And she kept her hands folded and her face the calm, unremarkable face of a housekeeper who has nothing to gain or lose from the man who pays her wages. He stepped down stiff with cold and long sitting, and she had time, in the moment before he reached the steps, to set the living man against the portrait in the gallery. The portrait had been painted of a younger one, smoother, a little vain about the mouth. This man was leaner and harder used. Travel had burned the softness off him. There was gray at his temple that the painter had never seen, and a way of holding his shoulders that said he expected no welcome and wanted none. He looked, she thought, like a man who had gone abroad to outrun something and had found it waiting for him at every inn. She curtsied with the others. He passed her with a nod that took in the whole row of them and none of them, and she breathed again and was angry at herself for the breath. For the first fortnight he scarcely spoke to her at all. He rode the estate in foul weather with Vane at his elbow and came back muddied and silent, and asked for fires in rooms that had been shut 20 years. Peg gave him his fires. She learned his hours, which were the hours of a man who did not sleep, candles burning in the library at 2 and 3 of the morning, a tray of cold meat untouched and sent down again. She learned that he drank, but carefully, like a man who did not trust himself to drink without counting. She learned that he never once mentioned a wife, or a betrothal, or any woman at all, and that the servants who had been long at Renfield had learned the same and traded the silence as a kind of scandal. And she told herself, in the cold of her own narrow room under the eaves, that this was nothing to her, that he was only the latest stranger to be housed and fed, and she did not believe it, because she had spent 2 years building a self that did not flinch, and she could feel the seams of it straining. The change began over a rent roll. Vane had brought the quarter's accounts to the Earl in the small parlor, and Peg had been sent up with the coal and the tea, and she was kneeling at the grate with her back to them when she heard Vane name the Drayton holding for arrears and recommend in his smooth agent's voice that the family be turned out at Lady Day. She knew the Draytons. She knew the field they worked, and the bad drainage in its lower acre that had cost them 2 harvests. And she knew, because she kept the household's own books and had eyes, that the figure Vane was reading was wrong, that he had charged the Draytons for a quarter already paid, the receipt for which had passed through her hands into the strong box not 6 weeks before. She should have said nothing. A housekeeper does not correct the steward before the master. She had schooled herself 100 times to the wisdom of saying nothing. But she thought of the Drayton children, and of how it is that a man like Vane builds a reputation for thrift on the backs of people who cannot read a column, and the thing came out of her before she had decided to let it. "Begging your pardon, my lord, the Lady Day quarter for Drayton was paid. The receipt is in the box. I entered it myself. The room went still." Vane turned on her the look he kept for servants who forgot themselves, but the Earl did not look at Vane. He looked at her, and it was the first time he had truly looked at her, and she felt it like a draught from an open door. "You enter receipts," he said. "The household ones, my lord. This one came to me by error, and I held it for Mr. Vane. That was a lie, and a clean one. She had held it because she had suspected exactly this. If you send for the box, you will find it dated." He sent for the box. The receipt was there, dated and signed, and Vane's figure was wrong by a whole quarter's rent, and a family that would have been on the road by April kept its roof. Vane recovered himself with a story about a clerk's slip, and the Earl let him have it. But something had shifted in the parlor, and all three of them knew it. When Peg gathered her things to go, the Earl said, not unkindly, "Mrs. Hale, you read accounts well, for a housekeeper." "I keep what I'm given to keep, my lord," she said, and went out, and stood a moment in the cold passage with her heart going like a hammer, furious at her own tongue and unable to be sorry. After that he began to ask her things. Small things at first, asked carelessly, as a man asks the nearest competent person what the West Meadow had yielded before it was let go to rushes, which of the tenants could be trusted, and which watched, why the home farm carried 2 more men than its acreage warranted. And she answered, because to refuse would have been stranger than to answer, and because she admitted this only to herself, late, in the dark, it was a pleasure she had not tasted in 2 years, the pleasure of being asked a thing she knew and giving the true answer to a man who listened. She was careful. She salted her knowledge with "I had it from the old steward's books," and the dairy woman told me she built a little scaffolding of plausible sources around everything she could not have known as Mrs. Hale of nowhere. But the scaffolding strained too, because she knew too much, and she could see, in the narrowing of his attention, that he had begun to notice the strangeness of her even as he leaned on it. The worst of it, the sweetest and the worst, was the evening of the boundary. He had got it into his head, from some old plan badly drawn, that the line between the Renfield land and the glebe ran along the beach avenue, and he meant to claim a strip of pasture on the strength of it, and he said so over the estate map spread on the library table, with Peg standing by to hold a candle, and she, looking at the map, saw at once that he was wrong, that the line ran from the broken cross to the ford and always had, that the avenue was planted inside the boundary by his own grandfather, that to claim the strip was to claim what was not his, and to make an enemy of the parson for the sake of 3 acres of poor grass. And she told him so, not as a servant suggests, as a woman who has argued boundaries with surveyors across her father's table since she was 12. She set her finger on the cross and walked it to the ford and named the deed that fixed it. And when he pushed back, she pushed harder. And for the length of perhaps 4 minutes they were not Earl and Housekeeper at all, but 2 people who both understood land arguing it out as equals, and she forgot herself entirely. And it was the happiest she had been in 2 years. She caught it too late. She saw him watching her, not the map, her, with a look that was half wonder and half something colder, something reaching back. She set the candle down. She said, "I'm sure your lordship knows his own ground far better than I," in the flat, dead voice of Mrs. Hale. And she dropped her eyes, and the moment closed. But he had seen. She knew he had seen, because he said quietly, almost to himself, "Where did a housekeeper learn to read a deed?" And she gave him some answer about a clever father in trade, and got herself out of the room. In the passage she leaned against the cold wall and pressed her hand flat to her own chest and thought, he will turn his head a little more each time, and one day he will have the whole of it, and I cannot let it come to him as charity or as pity in a quiet room. It must come to him with proof, before witnesses, or it will be denied and I will be turned off as a madwoman who imagines herself a lady. She had learned that much from her own ruin. A truth without paper is only a story, and a woman's story is the cheapest thing in England. So she hunted. The Renfield muniment room was a long, cold chamber off the old wing, deep in dust, where the dead earls had thrown their papers for 200 years, and Redgrave had served the estate as solicitor long enough to have his own hand in half the boxes. Peg had the keys. A housekeeper keeps all the keys. She went by night, with a shuttered lantern, and she had 2 helpers in it. The first was old Nan Comfrey, who had scoured pots at Ainsworth Grange when Peg was a child in leading strings, and who had come to Renfield in her age to die warm in a corner of the kitchens. Nan had known her at once, known the walk, the chin, the Ainsworth way of standing, and had said nothing before the others, only had touched Peg's sleeve one night by the fire, and whispered, "I buried your mother's linen, Miss Margaret. I'd know you in my grave," and had wept, and had kept the secret like a stone in her mouth ever since. Nan remembered the deathbed. Nan remembered the lawyer Redgrave, coming and going with his black box, and a letter sealed with Sir Henry's own ring, and the way the talk of bankruptcy had started in the village before the poor man was cold, started too neat and too fast to be anything but planted. Nan could not read, but Nan remembered, and memory, Peg knew, could be made to stand up in a court if there were paper beside it to lean on. The second helper was Tom, the under-footman, 23 and quick, who hated Vane with the pure hatred of a clever poor boy for a clever cruel master, and who would carry a candle or a message or a folded paper and ask no questions and forget he had done it. Tom could go where Peg could not without remark. A footman on the stairs at midnight is nothing. Together over the slow weeks, they went through the boxes, and Peg learned to read the hand of every clerk who had ever served the estate, and most of all the dry, cramped hand of Silas Redgrave. And while she hunted in the dark, the danger drew in. Vane had not forgiven the rent roll, and he was no fool. He had begun to watch her. She caught him once at the foot of the muniment stair when she came down at 2 a.m, and she carried it off, a housekeeper checking a damp wall. But she saw the calculation in his eyes. He took to asking the other servants where Mrs. Hale had come from, what house she had served in before, and finding, as she had always known he would, that there was nothing behind her, no character from a former place that would bear a letter, only a story she had told well. A housekeeper with no past is a small mystery in an ordinary house. In a house where the master had begun to look at her too long, it was a danger. And then the carriage came that she had dreaded for 2 years. She knew the arms on the door before it had stopped, knew them in her body before her mind named them. And she stood in the hall with the rest as the footman handed down first her Uncle Cornelius Ainsworth, grown heavier and grayer and more pleased with himself, master now of the Grange that was hers. And then, stepping stiff and dry and careful after him, Silas Redgrave. They had come, she understood at once, because the new Earl was asking questions. They had come to stand at his elbow and confirm the succession and soothe him and make sure the ground stayed firm under their feet. They had come to be flattered and reassured. And it fell to Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, to show them to their rooms. She did it. She carried the candle up the stairs before the 2 men who had stripped her of her name and her father and her place in the world. And she named the temperature of the water and the hour of dinner in a voice that did not shake, and Cornelius did not glance at her twice, Because who looks at a housekeeper? And Redgrave looked at her once, one dry, pale lawyer's glance, and she felt the cold drop straight through her, certain he had seen, certain it was over. But his eyes passed on. She was older than the girl he had ruined and thinner, and dressed in stuff and a cap. And the last place on earth Silas Redgrave expected to find Margaret Ainsworth was carrying his candle. He did not know her. She set the light on his mantle and wished him a good evening and went out and was sick, quietly in the cold of the back stair, and then wiped her mouth and went down to see to the dinner because the dinner had to be seen to. It was at that dinner, serving as she had served them, standing at the sideboard with the wine while the gentlemen talked, that she had her near breaking. The Earl had been drawn out by his guests, by the good claret and the old wound, and the talk had come round, as she had prayed it would not, to the matter of his broken marriage. Cornelius, oily, condoling, had said something of how fortunate his lordship had been to be spared, and Redgrave had nodded over his glass, and the Earl, looking into the fire, not at any of them, had said in a low voice gone bitter as aloes, "I was spared a fortune hunter who flung herself at the first richer purse the moment she thought my fortune unsure. The Ainsworth schemer. I have her own hand for it. I keep her notes still, God knows why, to remind myself what a woman's word is worth." The decanter was steady in Peg's grip. That was the thing she was most proud of afterward in the cold, that the decanter did not so much as tremble, that not a drop went onto the cloth. She stood 3 feet from the man she had been promised to, and heard him call her a schemer and a liar over his own wine, on the strength of a note she had never written, in a hand that was not hers, fed to him by the dry gray man 2 seats down who had forged it. And she filled the Earl's glass and stepped back to the sideboard, and her face was the still blank face of a servant who hears nothing, because nothing said in that room is meant for her. Every word was a blade, and she let them all land, and she did not bleed where it could be seen. She thought, with a clarity that frightened her, I could speak now. I could set the decanter down and say, "My lord, I am Margaret Ainsworth, and that note is a forgery, and the man at your table forged it." And they would have her quietly taken away. Redgrave would have his story ready before she reached the door. The housekeeper had run mad, had fixed on the master. Poor creature. Send for the doctor. There was no proof in this room, only her word. And her word was the cheapest thing in England. They had seen to that themselves. So she said nothing. She carried the wine. She waited, because waiting with proof in your hand is power, and waiting without it is only suffering. And she meant to come to them with power. She went up that night shaking and dry-eyed, and she and Tom went back to the boxes. And on the 3rd night after, they found it. Tom had pulled down a clutch of boxes from the high shelf where the late Earl's private correspondence had been thrown. Papers Redgrave had handled when the old Earl died and had plainly never thought any soul would sort again. And Peg, going through them by the shuttered lantern with her cold fingers, came on a packet of letters tied in faded tape. And among them, misfiled, slid in careless or in haste between 2 dead and meaningless things, a letter still sealed. Sealed with a ring she knew. The Ainsworth ring, the broken tower crest, her father's own seal pressed into wax gone brittle and brown with 2 years' age, and on the cover, in the failing hand of a dying man, the direction to Julian, Earl of Renfield. To be given into his own hand. She knew it before she touched it. The letter Nan had watched him seal. The letter that had never been delivered, that Redgrave had carried out of the death chamber in his black box and let lie here all this while, because to burn a thing is to risk being seen to burn it, and a careless man trusts the dust. Her hands shook now where they had been steady over the wine, and beneath it, folded loose, a clerk's working draft in a junior hand, scored and corrected. The rough of a marriage settlement, naming Ainsworth Grange and the sum of £40,000 settled upon Margaret Ainsworth absolutely, to her sole use, against the day she should wed the heir of Renfield. The true settlement, the one the county had been told never existed, that had died with her father near bankrupt and his daughter with nothing. She knelt in the dust with the lantern between her knees and the sealed letter in one hand and the draft in the other, and she did not weep, because she had spent her tears 2 years ago. But something in her chest that had been locked since that winter came open at last, and in the same hours, though she did not yet know it, in the warm library at the front of the house, the Earl sat over a box of his predecessor's papers that he had taken to sorting in his sleepless nights, and turned up a memorandum in a dry, cramped hand he had no reason to know was Redgrave's. A few lines that named a settlement he had been told was never made, and a will he had been told never existed, and sat very still, the claret cold at his elbow, while the floor of everything he had believed for 2 years began, quietly and from the other side of the house, to give way beneath him. Julian did not send for her the next morning, and that silence told Peg more than any summons could have. She had learned, in 2 years of reading the moods of houses, that the dangerous men were not the ones who shouted, but the ones who went quiet and began to arrange things. And Julian, since the evening she had watched him stand over a single sheet of Redgrave's writing, with a face gone the color of tallow, had become very quiet, and had begun, very precisely, to arrange things. Invitations went out under his hand to the county families he had so far neglected. A letter rode south to London by the fast post, and another, she noted, to the chambers of an attorney whose name she did not know, but whose direction Tom copied for her off the blotter in a hand that trembled with excitement. And to Renfield Hall, by the master's own request, came at last a summons that Cornelius Ainsworth and Mr. Silas Redgrave could not refuse without confessing they had reason to fear it. A gathering, the Earl wrote, to settle once and for all the disputed older accounts of the estate, and to confirm, before witnesses, the succession that had so long been allowed to rest on assumption. It was, Peg understood when Tom brought her the report of it, the cleverest cruelty she had ever seen done with good manners. Julian had baited the hook with the one thing the two men wanted above all to hear, that their title to everything was about to be made unassailable, and they were coming to swallow it whole. She dressed that day, not as Margaret Ainsworth might once have dressed, but as Mrs. Hale always did, in gray, in plain linen, with the chatelaine of keys at her waist, because the discipline that had kept her alive forbade her to break her own habit 1 hour too soon. But beneath the floor of the still room, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with tape, lay the things she had hunted 2 years to hold. Sir Henry's own sealed letter, the wax unbroken, addressed in her father's dear failing hand to the cousin he had chosen for her, the clerk's draft of the true marriage settlement, with its plain words securing Ainsworth Grange and her fortune to her absolutely and to her heirs, and, folded smallest of all because it sickened her most to touch, the forged note in the counterfeit of her writing that had taught a stranger to despise her. She carried them up the back stair herself. She would let no one else's hands be the last to lift them out of the dark. The great hall of Renfield had not held so many people since the old Earl's day. The long tables were drawn back and chairs set out, and the county came in their winter best. The Marleys, the Fentons, old Lady Ostray, who had once mistaken Peg's authority for impudence, and now sat fanning herself not 3 feet from a woman she did not recognize. At the head of the room, grave and upright, sat the man Julian had been careful to invite first, Sir Rowland Pike, magistrate for the 100, a heavy, unhurried man with small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing, and beside him a spare, dark London attorney with an ink-stained finger and a folio of blank paper, who had been introduced to the company only as a gentleman come to assist with the accounts. Cornelius arrived in a new coat and the high color of a man who believed himself about to be confirmed in his greatness. Redgrave came at his elbow, soft and dry and watchful, his lawyer's eye already counting exits the way Peg counted candles. Vane stood by the wall where a steward stands, between his masters and the door, not yet knowing he was the loose stone the whole arch would fall through. Julian rose. He did not raise his voice. He had learned abroad, perhaps, that a low voice in a large room compels a silence a loud one never can. He thanked them for coming. He spoke of the estate, of debts long disputed, and a history long left in shadow, and said that in setting his house in order he had found himself obliged to settle not merely the accounts but the truth beneath them. For an estate, he said, is only its title, and a title resting on a falsehood is a debt that comes due upon the innocent. He said he had lately come into possession of certain papers, and then he did the thing Peg had not dared hope he would do. The thing that told her he had understood at last not only the fraud, but everything the fraud had cost. He turned and looked down the length of the hall to where his housekeeper stood in gray by the screen, and he said, "I think the lady who can best explain these papers had better speak for herself." The room turned with him. Peg felt every face come round, felt Lady Austrey's fan stop, felt Cornelius's puzzlement and Redgrave's first cold prickle of alarm. She stepped forward into the long aisle between the chairs, and she untied the strings of the housekeeper's apron and laid it across the back of a chair, and she put off Mrs. Hale as a traveler puts off a coat at her own door. "My name," she said, and her voice did not shake, because she had practiced this composure across 2 years of swallowed words and meant to spend it now all at once, "is Margaret Ainsworth. I am the only child of Sir Henry Ainsworth of Ainsworth Grange, and I have kept this house 18 months under another name because it is the house I was promised, and because the proof of what was done to me had passed through these walls and I meant to dig it out before I spoke." The hall broke into noise, and Sir Rowland's flat hand upon the table broke the noise. "You will be heard," he said to her and to the room both, in order. "Go on, madam," she went on. She had ordered it as she ordered a ledger, from the firmest entry outward, and she laid the first thing on the table before the magistrate with steady fingers. "My father, dying, wrote a letter to the cousin he had chosen for me, to the present Earl. It was given, with his will and my marriage settlement, into the hands of his solicitor, Mr. Silas Redgrave, to deliver. It was never delivered. I found it not 3 weeks ago, mislaid among the late Earl's papers in this house, the seal unbroken." She set it down. "The seal is my father's. Any man here who knew Sir Henry's ring may say so." Old Lady Austrey leaned and looked and said in a wondering voice that she had dined off Henry Ainsworth's plate 40 years and would know that crest in her grave, and Sir Rowland broke the wax himself and read, and as he read his heavy face changed. For the letter named Margaret sole heir of all her father had, in plain unmistakable love. It affirmed the betrothal as the dearest settled wish of a dying man, and it begged the young cousin, sight unseen, to be gentle with a girl who would come to him with a great fortune and a sharper head than her years, and to trust nothing said against her by men who stood to gain by her ruin. Julian, standing, had gone white to the lips, and Peg did not look at him, because if she looked at him while those words were read aloud, she thought she might not finish, and she meant to finish. She laid down the second paper. "This is the clerk's draft of the marriage settlement my father executed. It secures Ainsworth Grange and the whole of my fortune to me absolutely, not to any husband, not to any male heir, to me. You were told, all of you, that Sir Henry died near bankrupt and that his daughter had nothing and no claim. You were told it because a will that gave a girl everything was suppressed, and an older will that gave the land to the male line was brought forward in its place." She turned for the first time toward the two men by the magistrate. "Was it not, Mr. Redgrave?" Redgrave had his answer ready, as such men always do. He rose, dry and unruffled, and spoke of forgeries and of the sad readiness of disappointed young women to dress up fancies as documents. He spoke of the proper venue of such claims, of the impropriety of trying them at a country supper, of the years that had passed without complaint. He wrapped the whole in so smooth a winding sheet of law that Peg saw 2 or 3 of the county faces begin, despite the letter, to waver. He was good. He had been good for 30 years. But he had built his whole life on the certainty that the girl would never have the third paper. And she laid the third paper down. "You speak of forgery, sir," she said. "Let us speak of forgery." She set, beside the magistrate's hand, the counterfeit note in the false copy of her writing, the note that had told a young man abroad that his betrothed was a schemer who had thrown herself at a richer suitor the hour her father weakened. "This was shown to the present Earl to break our engagement. It is written, you will see, in a hand made to pass for mine." And beside it she laid the ledger of Renfield Hall, open to a year of her own true entries. 18 months of coal and candle and rent accounted in the plain, clean hand the whole household knew as Mrs. Hale's. "Sir Rowland, you have before you 2 hands that claim to be one woman's. Compare them at your leisure. One of them has kept this house for 18 months under your county's eye. The other was written by a man who never saw me write." The magistrate bent over the 2 papers a long time, and the hall held its breath, and when he straightened his small eyes had gone hard as flint. "These were never made by the same hand," he said. "A child could see it. The note is a counterfeit." And he looked up at Redgrave with the particular contempt one keeper of the law keeps for another who has soiled it. It was then that the arch fell, and it fell, as Julian had foreseen through the loose stone of the steward. For Vane, against the wall, had been watching the room turn the way a drowning man watches the bank go by, and he was a man who had only ever served the winning side. When Sir Rowland's eye moved from Redgrave along the wall and came to rest on him, when he understood that he would be asked next and that his masters were already lost, Jasper Vane did the single thing left that might save him. He stepped forward, before he could be accused, to accuse. He had wondered, he said in a rush, these many months. He had served the estate faithfully and wondered at certain instructions, and now he saw it plainly and could not in conscience be silent. It was Mr. Redgrave and Mr. Cornelius Ainsworth, he said, who had together given out that Sir Henry died bankrupt. It was Redgrave who had kept the muniment keys those first months, and Redgrave who had bidden him never let the new Earl into the older boxes. And there had been money, he said, money passed to Cornelius's account out of Grange rents that no honest succession could explain. He turned upon the very men he had flattered for 2 years and emptied himself of every secret he had hoarded, in the hope, Peg supposed, that a man who turns king's evidence is sometimes let to slink away. He had no loyalty in him to break, only calculation, and the calculation had simply changed sides. After Vane there was no holding it. Cornelius, his new coat suddenly too large for him, blustered and then begged and then sat down heavily and said nothing at all, which was its own confession. Redgrave fought to the last with the only weapon he had ever owned, the law's own language. But the language would not save him against his own forged note, and a magistrate who had seen it for what it was. His voice grew thin and then querulous and then stopped, and a lawyer who has run out of words is a pitiable, finished thing. And Nan Comfrey, whom Peg had asked to wait in the passage, and who came in now small and straight in her best cap, gave the last brick of it in a clear old country voice that no London cunning could shake. She had served at Ainsworth Grange in the old days. She had stood at Sir Henry's deathbed. She had seen the will and the settlement and the sealed letter put with her own eyes into Mr. Redgrave's keeping. And she had seen Mr. Redgrave carry them away. And she had known Miss Margaret since the child could walk, and would know her among 10,000, name or no name. There is a kind of truth that all the law in England cannot argue with, and an honest old woman who has nothing to gain and says I was there is that kind. Sir Rowland did not hurry even then. He gathered the papers and heard Nan again on one point, and put 2 quiet questions to the London attorney about the form of the settlement, and only then did he give judgment, and he gave it standing, as a man gives a thing he means to have remembered. The suppressed will and the marriage settlement, he declared, he held upon their face and upon this testimony to be the true and valid instruments of the late Sir Henry Ainsworth. Margaret Ainsworth was his sole heir. Ainsworth Grange and her father's fortune were hers, settled upon her absolutely, as her father had willed and as the law she had been cheated of had always intended. Her name was her own again, and the slander upon it was a proven forgery, to be known as such throughout the county. Silas Redgrave and Cornelius Ainsworth he bound over to answer at the assizes for fraud and forgery and the conversion of another's estate, and he would see, he said with a grim courtesy, that the indictment was drawn tight. As for the steward Vane, here he looked at Julian, for that was the Earl's to give. The Earl said only that a man who would betray 2 masters in an afternoon was no man to keep a third's accounts, and that Vane might consider himself dismissed his place, and was fortunate the magistrate's interest in him went no further than the door. Vane went out by that door white and unthanked, having sold everything he had and bought nothing, and the county watched him go in a silence more terrible to a vain man than any uproar. The hall emptied slowly. In a great rustle of astonishment and apology, Lady Austrey pressing Peg's hand and calling her dear Miss Ainsworth, and not seeming to remember she had ever called her anything else. And at the last, when the candles had burned low, and the long room was theirs alone, Julian came to her across the floor, where she had stood, and waited so many cold mornings, and stopped a careful distance off, as a man stops who knows he has no right to come closer uninvited. He did not, to her lasting credit of him, beg. He did not seize her hands or talk of fate. He said, "Lo, I was lied to. I have heard your father's letter read out tonight, and I know now to the word how I was lied to, and by whom, and that the note I believed was never yours." He stopped, and made himself go on, and the going on was the thing that moved her. But I will not stand here and tell you that being lied to excuses it. I broke faith with a woman I had never troubled to meet, on the word of men who profited by it, and then I went abroad rather than face even my own conscience. And while I was gone, you lost your name and your home and your good fame, and swept the floors of the house that should have been yours. No lie of Redgrave's gives me back those 2 years to you. I cannot undo them. I will not insult you by pretending I can. He drew a breath. I have watched you keep this house better than I could keep it. Argue me down over a boundary and be right. Save a tenant family I would have let vain turn out. You never needed saving, least of all by me. So I do not offer you rescue, Margaret. I offer you a partnership if you will have it. Between equals, I am asking you to marry me, not the girl in a miniature I was once shown. You, the woman who beat all of them tonight with a ledger and 3 sheets of paper. She let the silence stand a moment, because she had earned the right to let it stand, and because a woman who has waited 2 years does not answer in 2 seconds. She thought of the cold gallery and the portrait she had been taught to hate, and of how strange it was that hatred had not survived the months of watching the living man be lonely and just and slow to anger. She found she did not want to punish him. She had spent her hunger for that on Redgrave, where it belonged. But neither would she be lifted up like a thing restored to a shelf. I will marry you, she said at last, and saw the breath go out of him. But understand me, because I mean to be understood once and never have to say it twice. The Grange is mine in my own right, settled on me absolutely, and it stays so when I am your wife. I will run Renfield with you and my own land beside it, and I will be no man's housekeeper again, not even yours, however kindly meant. A corner of her mouth moved, the first ease she had let herself in a long while. And I marry you, Julian, because you asked it of me tonight as I am, knowing all of it, not because you came too late to save me. I never needed saving. I needed only to be heard. Tonight, I was heard. The rest I can choose freely, and I choose this. He bowed his head to that, as a man bows to a thing greater than himself, and when he lifted it, there was a wet brightness in his eyes he did not trouble to hide, and that, more than any word, told her she had chosen rightly. She saw to her own, in the days that followed, as the disciplined always do. Nan Comfrey would end her years not in service but in a snug cottage on Grange land, with a fire she need never lay herself and a girl to wait on her, and would die, some peaceful winter far off, mistress of her own hearth. Tom, who had carried her messages when carrying them was dangerous, she would not leave a footman. He was made under steward before the month was out, with Vane's old rooms and the promise of the stewardship itself when he had learned it, and learn it he did, honestly, which is more than his predecessor ever had. On the last morning Peg woke before the house as she had 1,000 times, and went down through the cold halls of Renfield in the blue dark, by habit, by love of the quiet hour, and counted the coal and the candles one final time, not because anyone required it of her now, but because it had been the discipline that kept her alive, and she meant to part from it as a friend. Then she did the thing the housekeeper Mrs. Hale had never once been permitted to do. She did not go out by the servants' door at the back. She walked the length of the great gallery, past the portrait of the man she would marry, and she crossed the stone hall where the county had heard the truth, and she lifted the iron latch of the front door with her own hand and went out by it into the white morning, no longer a nameless woman keeping another's house, but the mistress of it and the mistress of her own restored Grange, walking out at last by the door that had always, in justice, been hers. So I will leave you there, with Margaret going out by the front door of her own life, and I will ask you the question I think you already know I mean to ask. How long could you have done it? How long could you have kept your face still and your tongue quiet, swept the floors of a house that should have been yours, served the very men who robbed you their wine with steady hands, and waited, not weeks, but years, for the 1 hour when the proof was in your grasp and the room would have to listen? Most of us would have broken in a month. She did not break, and that is why she won. if her patience moved you, if you have ever sat silent in a room you understood better than anyone in it and held your peace until your moment came, then stay with me, subscribe, and tell me below how long you could have kept the secret, because there is always another wronged woman whose story is waiting. And next time the floor she sweeps may be one you know.